Hello, I'm Martine Croxall. Welcome to Dateline London. My first time hosting the programme, which is very exciting. Hold on to your hats. This week we discuss the successes and failures of the worldwide vaccination programmes against COVID-19 and the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Our guests are the French journalist Agnès Poirier of the magazine L'Express, the American journalist and broadcaster Jeff McAllister. And with me, suitably distant still in the studio, is the BBC's science editor, David Shukman. We're welcoming you, David, back into the building for the first time in about 15 months.
It's a very strange feeling, but very nice.
Well, welcome back. I
Thank you so much.
also hear that your mum is an avid Dateline London viewer.
She's a huge fan, so I can't make any mistakes.
No, you can't. She'll be so glad that you're here with me on your first outing.
It's a great pleasure.
Same. Now, in the UK and the US, the vaccination programmes against the pandemic have been hugely successful. But what about elsewhere? Have policymakers really listened to the scientists? Vaccinations for some, of course, will be the key to being able to go travelling again. Fewer planes flying over the last year did some environmental good, but more flights are now scheduled again. So what further damage are we going to be doing to our climate? This is another area, of course, where scientists and policymakers may not exactly be on the same page. Will this crisis be discussed at the upcoming G7 summit being held in the UK? And are there any signs that we're prepared to suffer inconveniences or sacrifices, if you like, to avoid a global warming catastrophe? Agnès, let me start with you. How well do you think European policymakers have followed the science when it comes to vaccinations?
Well, it's a balancing act if you're a head of state or head of a government. Of course, they've been listening to scientists. I think they must be feeling as if that's all they've been doing in the last 18 months. But there's science and there's politics, and you have to make, in the end, political decisions. And actually, it's interesting to look at the different countries in Europe, because they've gone about their lockdowns in very different ways, with sometimes very good results, but different methods. But I'm very happy to report to Dateline that the vaccination rollout in continental Europe, in France, in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, is doing extremely well. After, of course, the catastrophic first few weeks, first 2 months, I would say. Yesterday, the French president announced that anyone from the age of 18 was now able to get vaccinated in France. And surprise, surprise, I'm sure you remember that the French were, leading in anti-vaccine filling in the Western world, but it's not the case anymore. Perhaps because at first they were denied their vaccine, and as you know, we are quite contrarian, and as soon as there was no vaccine for them, they wanted it. So now the latest poll issued yesterday showed that 70% of French people want to be vaccinated. They were only 40% last summer. So good news all around.
I wouldn't dream of calling the French contrarian, but you may. Of course. Jeff, I was reading today about the rather different infection rates between the different states of America. I think North Dakota's still got pretty high infection rates, and whereas Vermont, a really tiny state in comparison, has much lower infection rates. How much of this is down to vaccination uptake?
Some of it is vaccination uptake. Some of it is the residue of the different mask-wearing policies and general public health awareness and interest of the state governments, which were, especially in the Trump administration, fundamentally in charge of what happened. All the states now, at least according to the best knowledge, can get essentially all the vaccines they want. So it's not any longer a question of supply and demand or supply, it's a question of demand. And there are regional differences and even political differences in uptake. There is an anti-vax kind of stronghold among Republicans. There was a period when 50% of Republican men so they would not get a vaccine. We're now down to 20% of Republicans saying they will not get a vaccine, as opposed to 29% a month ago. Again, I think as more and more of people's neighbors are getting it, and some states are offering lottery prizes of $1 million to people who get vaccinated, and the public enthusiasm is kind of building. I think it will sort of even out over time. And really what is remarkable is how good these vaccines are. Unlike flu vaccines and other sorts of vaccines, the kind of the possibility of reinfection, the possibility of going to the hospital or of death, it's almost a magic bullet. And so I think the success of the science is leading people to understand that this is a very good thing to do.
David, there was some environmental benefits, certainly, to the lockdown, and far fewer flights, of course, going around the world. But how much of that are we going to hold on to once the planes take off?
Well, I mean, the new figures that have come from China show that their emissions have shot back right up again. And this comes at a time when the science has never been clearer, that by 2030, to have the best chance of avoiding the worst effects of global warming, emissions globally need to come down by nearly half. That's in the next 9 years. Well, they've been going in the wrong direction. I think where the ground has shifted dramatically just in the last really couple of months is that suddenly you've got one big economy after another declaring that they will try to cut their own emissions by roughly half by 2030. Joe Biden with the States, the EU, Japan and Korea, likewise, the UK has set a target of a 78% cut by 2035. Now, this changes the calculations about global warming, but it does mean that all these governments are now under massive pressure to deliver these pledges. It's one thing to declare a promise, another to get into shape and position the policies that get you there. And I think the big difference now is that suddenly you have a time frame which makes it very difficult for the current crop of politicians to wriggle out of. If you've got a target for 2050, you won't be in power by the time that comes around. If you've got a target of 2030, well, whatever happens right now could rebound on you.
Is this going to be then that we all start to change our habits because we're on that very edge of the cliff edge, or is it going to all have to be legislated for to make us change?
I think it'll be a mixture of everything. I mean, some of the changes that have reduced emissions already have happened without us noticing. So all our electrical appliances, our fridges, for example, use far less power than they used to 10 years ago. So electricity demand has fallen as a result of that. Without really realising, we switch on a light switch. Our power in the UK, certainly, and other countries, is more and more renewable rather than coming from coal. But the harder things remain to be tackled. How we heat our homes, how we get around, these are going to be much tougher to sort out.
Agnes, how willing are people in France generally, if you can be that general, to embrace the idea that life is going to have to change, our choices are going to have to be different in the future?
Well, you know, it takes two to tango. And basically, I don't know if you're aware, but a month ago, there was this momentous decision that French MPs passed as law. It's now a law. France has banned domestic flights on short routes that can be traveled by train in under 3 hours. But that's momentous. It's the first time any major economy has actually prohibited domestic flights or short routes, if you'd like. And that could have, you know, an impact straight away. It represents about 15% of all French domestic flights. You know, I was looking at figures, for instance, in the UK. Every year, there are 500,000 flights between London and Manchester, when actually it only takes 2 hours by train. I think what we've learned as citizens, but also as consumers, during the pandemic is that the virus spread really because of mass tourism and mass, you know, air traveling. And perhaps we've reached our limits. And, you know, we have to be ready to take the train. In Europe, it's so enjoyable anyway. And at least in countries like France or in Italy, it's heavily subsidized. It doesn't cost much. And that's the way we used to do it. Why not doing it on short routes?
Yes, and
I think that will...
Luxembourg introduced free public travel last year for everybody, which is, you know, something almost unimaginable to us here. Jeff, we know that Joe Biden has a very different view of climate change, global warming from Mr. Trump, from Donald Trump. But how easy is it going to be getting stuff through Congress?
Well, I mean, nothing is easy for him. He's got to split Congress, and he's going to have to be lucky. And if he was trying to, for instance, impose a carbon tax, we'd see, a lot of difficulty. I think, though, that the interesting thing is how much the ground is changing in renewables, in particular. The technology is really, really advancing quickly. Biden this week drove an electric Ford F-150 pickup truck. This is not a car for Harvard professors who eat granola. This is a pickup truck for red state people who want to herd cattle. And he said, this sucker moves fast. It's actually it's going to be perhaps the first mass market electric vehicle that's going to be a success in places outside the coasts. And it's cheap, relatively, and this is the way that energy efficiency is going to happen. I mean, people don't mind more efficient buildings and better cars, and we can't change it from just by not riding on airplanes. The International Energy Association, which is the group set up after OPEC for the consuming states, has a path to energy carbon neutrality by 2050. And they say that only 4% of the reduction has to come from lifestyle changes from us. The rest of it can come from big structural changes that, with intelligent governments, should be actually quite straightforward to implement. I know the politics are hard, perhaps especially in the US, but I do think it's a period of optimism for climate change.
How lovely to have some optimism at this point. Let's turn our attention then to the Middle East and the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip after 11 days of violence, with both sides claiming victory. But Israel clearly doesn't think it's diminished Hamas enough, and Hamas still has rockets aimed at Israeli targets. There's also the major problem this time of violence between Jews and Israeli Arabs, something not seen in the region for many years. Well, the truce faced an early test on Friday when fresh clashes broke out at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in occupied East Jerusalem. David, the casualties on each side starkly different. At least 243 people were killed in Gaza. In Israel, 12 people killed, according to its medical service. Likewise, their military capabilities and where they get that military hardware from, very different.
As Jeremy Bowen has been saying during his reporting of this conflict, it's an asymmetric war. You've got one powerful, wealthy force on one side and an impoverished force on the other. But if you like, one of the things that goes towards levelling that imbalance is rockets. We've seen that in the Second World War, in the First Gulf War. If one side can fire rockets from mobile launchers that are hard to detect until the launch happens, there can be an advantage. And I think right now, just purely in military terms, the Hamas commanders will be trying to make an assessment of the fact that of all the rockets they launched, 90% were intercepted by the Israeli Iron Dome system, but 10% did get through and did cause fatalities and injuries. They'll be trying to work out how many remaining rockets they have, how quickly they can get back into the business of making more. And of course, on the Israeli military side, they're going to be doing those assessments as well to try to work out how much of a threat Hamas remains with its rockets. And interestingly, I saw a report earlier today that the mayors of two of the Israeli towns hit hardest by Hamas rockets object to the ceasefire because they say the threat remains. So
Sderot and Ashkelon.
Indeed. And so for them, they're very alive to the option that the Hamas commanders have of potentially continuing this.
And of course, we understand that Iran supplies Hamas. They build in tunnels, but also Joe Biden's offered to replenish what Israel has used during this recent conflict. Yes,
to bolster the standard of Israeli protection, and then within Gaza, from what we understand from what's been reported, it seems that the rockets are assembled within Gaza, probably with components that are smuggled in, almost certainly with Iranian guidance and help. The extent to which the attacks on the tunnels have disrupted that process, we'll have to wait and see.
There were clashes in Jerusalem and other parts of Israel, Agnes, as well. I mean, we must remember that 20% of the population of Israel are Arab Israelis. These clashes, though, are civilian against civilian, not Hamas against the State of Israel, a very, very different dynamic.
Yes, and that's quite new. I think, in the last 11 days, I mean, there's been some reasons to be optimistic, but also many more, actually, to be pessimistic about the future. Well, a slight ray of hope is that diplomacy is back. But we can also see that Joe Biden is quite stuck in his approach to the crisis. He was quite hesitant, of course, and there are many voices in the Democratic Party who want him to be much tougher with Israel. Of course, we have now the UN could actually come back on the world stage and be much more dynamic and participate much more than it did in the last 4 years of Trump. And indeed, France pushed for a resolution at the UN Security Council, and France and Germany were really behind Egypt and Jordan in the ceasefire. And of course, Europe is very concerned. Every time there's a tension in the Middle East, well, we can see pro-Palestinian protest in the streets of Paris, Berlin, or London, as we've seen last weekend, turning very ugly. The Interior Minister in France had to ban protests, which of course took place anyway. And we saw some very anti-Semitic slogans, but also attacks. And this is becoming more and more recurrent in Europe, and that's a great concern. Well, now, the problem is the two-state solution is dead. And I think that's the next step for the world diplomacies. What next? Also, something that struck me, which is very sad, is that only a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, there were talks of a new government in Israel with, for the first time, the participation of an independent Arab party, and now this is also dead in the water. We are going to have Netanyahu is here to stay. Although there've been 4 elections in the last 2 years, there might be another one. I mean, Israeli democracy is in tatters. So, really, what is the next solution? Because the two-state solution is a thing of the past.
We know as well, Jeff, that Joe Biden has a very different approach to his foreign policy from Donald Trump. But the US vetoed the French ceasefire proposal while at the same time putting forward one of his own. I mean, can you explain that?
Yeah, I think this is the traditional role of the U.S. in Middle East policymaking or Israeli-Palestinian fighting. This actually, reminded me of times on the airplane with the previous secretaries of state going to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. What Biden people are saying about this is that he has this long relationship with Netanyahu. He has said kind of proudly, he once sent Netanyahu a picture autographed with, "Dear Bibi, I don't agree with a damn thing you say, but I love you." And he thought that softly, not ratcheting up the pressure publicly on Netanyahu, not as John Kerry did during the last Israeli foray into Gaza, actually going and failing to get a ceasefire. He thought that doing it quietly behind the scenes and showing the traditional relationship might work. Netanyahu has fences to mend. I mean, he was essentially a subcontractor of the Republican Party under both Obama and the Trump administration. So there was some leverage that Biden had to play against Netanyahu. And whether they have any real movement possible, I mean, the two-state solution does seem dead. They do seem to be making progress towards an Iran deal, which will, of course, require, Israel not to blow it up. Maybe there's some room for things to expand after this little bit of peacemaking. I'm not optimistic in this case, but you have to start somewhere.
Just quickly, how likely is it, do you both think, just very quickly if you would, that there will be more nations around the world that are recognising Palestine?
I mean, the momentum has been with the Israelis getting to make peace with the Gulf states rather than the other way around. I mean, I don't think the U.S. will be as against it as it used to be. I think the landscape is changing there in Congress and in public opinion. So maybe there's more room without irritating the Americans to do so.
Yeah, it's inflammatory to the Israelis as well, isn't it, Agnes? But do you think it's more likely that Palestine will get more recognition?
Well, I mean, there's a problem with, discriminating against Palestinians and them being second-rate citizens. So this will have to be addressed. But of course, Europe, Israel doesn't listen to Europe. It listens only to Washington. So the ball is in Biden's court.
So before we go, I just wanted to ask each of our guests about a subject that we all ought to be talking about, perhaps, but we're not. Let's ask Jeff first. This is where you get to sort of stretch your legs, go off-piste. It's like a jam session for news, isn't it?
Well, I mean, this is not exactly not talked about, but I just want to register my fury at Bitcoin, which I think is a scam. It's a Ponzi scheme where it goes up 30%, down 30% a day. The mining of Bitcoin now is using half the electrical output of Great Britain every day in order to produce these coins that have no value for anybody but terrorists and drug dealers, and regular currencies are perfectly effective to do what you need. So there's my screed for the day.
Okay, and they're not underpinned by something old-fashioned like gold. But I was talking to one of our close protection officers outside this building only the other day, David, about how you can buy environmentally friendly Bitcoin.
Well, it's alleged you can. It all depends where the power is generated.
That's what
the power of the service. That's all it comes down to.
You have to do your homework if you want to be, environmentally friendly in your purchasing of it. I don't understand it enough, Agnes. Do you?
Sorry?
Bitcoin. Do you understand it well enough to invest?
I know nothing about Bitcoins. I would not approach. I wouldn't come close to Bitcoins.
No, stick with the euro. Hey. So what about you, Agnes? What's the story that you'd like to draw our attention to?
It's like Bitcoins. We talked about it a bit, but it was such a joy to go back to a museum and an art gallery this week, and it was the same, in France, in Britain, all over Europe. They are reopening, and we learn. One lockdown after another, we learn things. And during the first lockdown in France, bookshops, for instance, were not deemed essential. But a few months later, a decree was passed and they were deemed essential. And the second lockdown was so much better because bookshops, wine shops, chocolate shops, and florists were deemed essential. And that changed. And now for the next lockdown, if or when there is one, I would really urge governments in Europe, in Britain, to open museums because they are a nourishment. I think it would actually do a lot of good for mental health of our different nations. And you're surrounded by beauty. You don't have to, buy stuff. And there are big places. So you can open the windows and you can be socially distanced. And it's essential to me. So I've been very happy this week because I returned to big museums in London.
Just very briefly then, Jeff, what did you miss?
In lockdown?
Yeah.
People mostly, and I agree about museums and culture. It gets forgotten too easily, and it is fantastic to see the blood getting back into the circulation system of cultural life.
I'm sure you missed coming into New Broadcasting House, David. Is that what you missed most of all?
Well, yes, of course. It's the camaraderie, it's the banter. I think actually I've been more efficient working at home. You can get on with things, but I do miss the social contact. If I can just say, I've got a Jeff-style rant about something we just do more on, plastic waste. We've forgotten about it with COVID and with climate change and all the other questions, but the plastic waste problem is getting worse, not better. And I'm with Jeff having a little fume about that.
I'm sure, though, that's partly, isn't it, because we've been using single-use plastics more and masks that you find everywhere.
Yes, you find everywhere. There's actually a website that gathers pictures of discarded masks. They've been found on coral reefs in Bali. But that's just part of the problem. The bigger problem is the whole system of retail and of production and of the petrochemical industries and the way we have a throwaway culture, which has been talked about. I mean, David Attenborough has sounded off about this for some time. There have been some changes, but I think we've perhaps taken our eye off the ball a little bit, and that's something I think we need more focus on. Rant over.
Well, not very ranty at all, and very wise words. I know this is probably a little unorthodox, but I would like to tell you all about a story that I think deserves far more attention. It's a story about the town of Northampton and the city of Peterborough, both in the east of England, if you're not sure where they are. They have settled, these two places, a long-standing disagreement over the pronunciation of the name of a river. The river is spelled N-E-N-E. If you live in Northampton, they say the River Nen, and in Peterborough it's the River Nene. How did they settle this dispute? Via a game of croquet. And Northampton won, so it's the River Nen, well, for now anyway, until they have a rematch. Isn't that a lovely civilised way to...
Until they escalate.
Until it escalates, yes, and then it's mallets at dawn. That brings us to the end of Dateline London for this week. Thank you to our guests, Agnes Poirier and Jeff McAllister, and our science editor, David Shupman. And thank you to you, of course, as well, for watching. Do join Sean Lay next week. I survived it. Same time, same place. Bye-bye.